able to get the kind of news that they need on that station. Their newspaper is now, for the most part, online, and so they need these TV and radio stations that give them the information that they need. I've had several Republicans from my state write me, former state legislators who are on the boards of these TVs. They also view it as a way of the local TV station in Austin, Minnesota. The former Republican leader in the state Senate is on the board. I visited with him recently when I was down there, and this is the place in Austin, Albert Lee area near the Iowa border, where they're able to get their unique news that gathers people together, that brings them together. And then there's the emergency alerts. Earlier this month, we were tragically reminded of the importance of this. Texas, New Mexico, the fires in Arizona. We rely on this information in local communities to know what to do and what's safe. This isn't a partisan issue. 77% of Republicans and 78% of Democrats report relying on public radio for emergency alerts and news. That's part of the reason why for a half a century we have agreed on a bipartisan basis in the US Senate to invest in public broadcasting. Yet now, congressional Republicans are using a partisan process to rubber stamp the president's unchecked power and rip away these resources, despite the fact that the American people support this on a 2-to-1 margin. I think about these stations in Duluth, in Granite Falls, in Austin, and every week 20 million people across the country actually listen to radio programs that were started out of our local Minnesota Public Radio, maybe Prairie Home Companion. They're listening to some of those former broadcasts, and they make them smile, and they make seniors feel happy when they're alone in the assisted living. Or maybe Marketplace, that also started in my state, and they're able to get the facts. They're able to get news about what's happening with the economy and interesting stories. I think a constituent of mine said it best. Public media serves us in many ways. We live in the middle of the country. We only watch PBS and listen to public radio, which provides local news coverage, arts programs, and thoughtful discussions on a wide variety of topics, in their words, without loud argument or obnoxious advertising. It provides information on local disasters, such as we recently experienced here in Bemidji. That's where Paul Bunyan is from, or that's where the statue is. Because of the reporting done on that devastating event, we were able to learn what was happening to the people and how we could help. We must support these vital resources that give voice to important local issues. In addition, the reckless cuts to foreign aid and development assistance play a critical role in promoting U.S. economic and national security by stabilizing volatile regions and decreasing the likelihood of U.S. troops being sent into battle. Helping our friends and allies, yes, it's the right thing to do, but it's also smart for us to do at home. I have, with Republican members of our congressional delegation in Minnesota, stood up together at press conferences to make sure we keep sending foreign aid, this is in the last 5 years, to Somalia, because we know the threat if we just close our eyes to what our terrorist forces trying to go up in leadership and take over regions of these countries, we know what happens. But if we just turn our back, you're going to find out what does happen, and it's not pretty, and it is not good for the United States of America. And it's certainly not good in our back and forth that we have with China and China's continuing investment in other parts of the world, whether it is infrastructure in Africa or sending food to countries in need. This recision would also weaken our global health programs. These programs not only show humanitarian leadership, they also keep us safe. You can't just put your head in the sand and hope that Ebola doesn't come your way, which we were able to at least limit its horrific spread by the work that we did overseas. Or bird flu, we've seen what happened there. Or what's happening right now on the southern border with screwworm. We are having this debate as we are seeing the grave results of dismantling USAID. In the midst of an intensifying war in Ukraine, the recision would also drastically cut funding from the account that provides economic assistance to our partners. You think about the President's work in the Mideast and the potential for extending the Abraham Accords and the potential for a peace deal there. Well, that is not going to be helped if we cut off the foreign aid to some of our only allies that are in the region, countries like Jordan. Foreign aid is about demonstrating leadership and compassion, but it is also about security. To conclude, as a daughter of a newspaperman, I know how important public media and the free press are to strengthening our democracy. Hacking away at public broadcasting and international aid is not just short-sighted, it's dangerous. These investments are relatively small in cost, yet immense in impact. They strengthen our country and strengthen our leadership. And we ask our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to look at what this means for our role in the world. We have 3 independent branches of government. We have a process that, just as Senator Murray is here, that Senator Collins and Senator Murray showed just last week, can be bipartisan, where we agree on budget amounts going forward. We have the power of the purse. We're Article 1 in the Constitution, and we better show our power instead of just being rolled and being members over there who are rubber stamping this president. Stand up and do your job. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, it all started with the stroke of a pen. Within hours of taking office in January, the President signed what can only be called a death sentence to millions of people all over the world. Executive Order 14169 simply read, quote, "It is the policy of the United States that no further United States foreign assistance shall be dispersed in a manner that is not fully aligned with the foreign policy of the President of the United States," end quote. The order directed a 90-day pause in payments while foreign assistance was reviewed. But it became clear that this was not a process for reviewing or reforming programs. It was the beginning of the end. A wholesale destruction of the enterprise from top to bottom, in defiance of the law and of logic. Presidents can save lives. They can also cost lives. And while almost every president has chosen to do the former, Donald Trump, aided by a band of loyalists and ideologues, has chosen instead to inflict death and disease and starvation on the world's most vulnerable. We used to be the indispensable nation that people around the world counted on for help. People would see the American flag, whether on the side of a truck or a sticker on a food parcel, and think, the good guys are here. Help is coming. But not anymore. We are causing death now. We are spreading disease now. We are deepening starvation now. And it's not because it's saving us huge sums of money or because saving lives somehow stopped being in our national interest. All of this suffering and misery is because a few people were hell-bent on ransacking the government and tearing down whatever it is that they didn't like or they didn't understand. To hell with the consequences. To them, the lives lost are just the cost of doing business. Move fast and break things is the ethos of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. But when you move fast and you break things in the United States Agency for International Development, tens of thousands of people perish. So let's start with how we got here. Following Trump's executive order, Secretary Rubio and Peter Marocco, the new director of the State Department's Office of Foreign Assistance, issued a stop work order on all 6,200 grants and contracts worldwide. They also ordered an immediate pause on new foreign assistance spending. That meant that partners who had already completed work were not getting paid. Contracts that had already been signed couldn't be executed. Days later, Morocco, along with a bunch of DOGE staffers, including a 19-year-old and a 23-year-old, physically barged into USAID and forced dozens of senior career officials to be put on leave over so-called insubordination. These people were just doing their jobs. His issue seemingly was with payments that had been approved before the executive order and were then making their way through the USAID payment system. Nevertheless, the career civil servants were escorted out of the building and locked out of their emails. Anyone who dared to push back or speak up was sidelined, including the acting administrator, who was pushed out to make way for Morocco to become deputy administrator. As he and his team looked for not just savings or efficiencies, but, quote, what they called viral abuse that would be easy to mock out of context, Fox News stepped into the breach to help. For days on end, their chyrons blared, "Viper's Nest," USAID accused of corruption long before Trump administration took aim. More ridiculous USAID spending repealed. Elon purged DC's slush fund. As the smear campaign kicked into overdrive, DOGE locked out all of the agency's employees, including those working in conflict zones, from their phones and emails. And in early February, Musk tweeted, quote, USAID is a criminal organization. Time for it to die. Days later, after carrying out the destruction, he wrote, we spent the weekend feeding USAID into the wood chipper. And just like that, one of the United States' primary instruments of soft power over the last 60 years, which has done everything from curing diseases to thwarting terrorism, was decapitated overnight. USAID's success in moral, political, economic, and security terms was made possible by scores of public servants who felt a responsibility to alleviate suffering, even if that meant putting themselves in harm's way. But in the end, it was torn down by a bunch of crazed ideologues who saw foreign assistance as an easy target to test drive their project of crippling the government. Perhaps abolishing the health department or the VA in the first few weeks was a bridge too far. But here was money going to help people in, as Madeleine Albright used to say, faraway places with hard-to-pronounce names. And no matter how much good it was doing for the people whose lives were saved and communities were built, but also for our national security, none of that mattered when all you had to do was make up some lies to justify the vandalism. It's been only a few months and already the loss of USAID and its critical work around the world has been catastrophic. More than 360,000 people have died as a result of the cuts. 360,000 deaths. And so I will be damned if I let a pundit or a Democratic strategist or a Republican strategist tell me that the American people signed up for allowing 360,000 people to die on purpose. For what? Deficit reduction? And to Patty Murray's point, 2 weeks ago they just blew up the deficit by trillions of dollars. The amount of money that it takes to save a starving child or to prevent the transmission of HIV/AIDS from mother to child is minuscule. And we do this because we're the good guys. And we do this because it's cheap. And we do this because when we need something from a friend in a foreign land, they think of us well because we're always on the scene to be helpful. These are not hypothetical or distant outcomes. We are no longer arguing about what might happen in the future. We are talking about what is happening across the planet right now. People are dying right now, not in spite of us, but because of us. We are causing death. We have gone from being the good guys, flaws, mistakes, and all, to being a conduit for death and sickness and hunger. A 10-year-old boy named Peter in South Sudan had contracted HIV from his mother at birth. His parents died while he was young, but medication through PEPFAR kept him alive. That was until February, when, without access to medication, Peter fell severely sick and later died. The health outreach worker who had cared for him said simply, "If USAID would be here, Peter would not have died." A pregnant woman in a Liberian village hemorrhaged and began to bleed heavily while in labor. But without gas, because of funding cuts, USAID ambulances stood idle, unable to help. And despite her neighbor's best efforts to carry her 10 miles on foot through the jungle to the nearest hospital, she died mid-journey along with her unborn son. Dorcas, a 10-year-old in Zambia, had gotten so used to her routine of taking HIV medication every night with her mom that she was confused when it ran out a few months ago. Her mom recounted, quote, "In the past week, she'll open up the tin and find that it's empty. She'll run down to the clinic and go check if she can collect her medication, and she'll come back and say, 'Oh, you're right, the clinic is closed. They're not there anymore.'" In Sudan, which has been ravaged by war and gripped by famine, a mother watched two of her children under the age of 3 wither from malnutrition and die after a soup kitchen that had been supported by USAID closed overnight. Days before he died, the older of the 2 children had asked for porridge. Quote, "I told him, we don't have any wheat to make that," his mother recalled, adding that the soup kitchen's daily meal, which the family was shared, was a godsend. A mother in Nigeria worried about how she would keep her infant alive, having just lost the other twin to malnutrition in the wake of funding cuts. A peanut paste, a supplement that had been paid for by the American Foreign Assistance, had been used to treat her newborns for malnutrition. She wondered about how she'd feed her child, and she said, "I don't want to bury another child." There are thousands and thousands of gut-wrenching stories just like this from every corner of the planet, with newborns and children and families and communities, and this is only what's happened in the last few months. Just imagine what's going to happen if we codify these cuts. We are not going to prevent every death. We know that. We're not going to be able to feed every child. We understand that. We cannot feasibly help every community that needs help. We accept that. But this is something different altogether. This is knowingly and willingly and needlessly inflicting horrific suffering on millions and millions of the most vulnerable people alive anywhere on the planet. And for what? To save money? The idea that any of this is about finding savings while at the same time Republicans are exploding the national debt by $4 trillion to cut taxes for billionaires just doesn't pass the smell test. And to top it all off, the administration is about to incinerate, is about to light on fire, is about to incinerate 500 metric tons of food aid because they let it expire while sitting in a warehouse for months. They are lighting food on fire. They lit food on fire. Food grown in the United States, manufactured in the United States, to be sent out to the most vulnerable people on the planet with a sticker with the United States emblem on it. And making America great again apparently is doing all of that and then letting it rot in a warehouse and then incinerating it. What the hell are we doing here? You want to have a conversation about debt and deficits. You want to have a conversation about aligning our foreign policy better. You want to have a conversation about whether or not the State Department, not the USAID agency, should have been funding operas and cultural enterprises in foreign countries. Fine, we can have that conversation. But I dare you to justify lighting food on fire. It wasn't so long ago that a Republican senator stood on this very floor talking about those in his party who claimed that cutting foreign aid was an easy way to save money. Quote, a lot of times people will say, well, cut foreign aid. But foreign aid is less than 1% of our budget. Foreign aid can make a difference when properly used. And if you ever have a chance, travel to the African continent and you will meet people who are alive today because the American taxpayer-funded antiviral HIV medications kept them alive. It is not easy to radicalize people who are alive because of the American taxpayer. That was Secretary Rubio as Senator Rubio. Why is this happening at all? I worry that there is a very specific and rather dark view about what the United States is capable of. It's a view of our military, it's a view of our economic power, it's a view of our cultural power, and it's a view of our moral authority, which is the best path forward as we decline is to lock it down, is to not engage with the world, is to not project power militarily, culturally, economically, morally. We are going from the indispensable nation, and by the way, this is a real thing. If you ever do foreign policy trips, people hang on the words of United States senators who sit on the Foreign Relations Committee, first among equals. People want to know, what's the United States doing? What's the United States doing? It doesn't matter what the issue is. It could be fighting malnutrition, it could be economics and trade, it could be military strategy. Everyone wants to know, what's the United States doing? You know what has changed in the last 6 months? They're moving on from us. They're not waiting to hear what the United States is doing. They've seen what the United States is doing. In Trump 1.0, we could basically be reassuring and say, we'll be back, don't worry, we're going through a rocky time. Now, China is in the breach. China has stepped up. It's not just that America's retreat is bad for us. It is really good for China. It is great for Russia. It's great if you're Hungary. The Kremlin was nearly instantaneous with its praise, calling the dismantling of the foreign aid enterprise a smart move. Autocrats in Hungary and El Salvador also celebrated USAID's demise. Now, there's a basic principle in political campaigns, which is if you are doing something that your opponent loves, you may want to reconsider whether it's a good strategy. The moment we did this, all the bad guys were like, very smart, good job, we're very happy for you, excellent. China has seized this opportunity with a little more specificity because they have the opportunity to step into this role. They are working on child nutrition and landmine clearing in Cambodia, health and education in Nepal, disaster response in Myanmar, climate resilience in Mongolia. And it doesn't take a great deal of imagination to understand what this will look like in a few years' time. China will become the partner of choice for countries big and small all around the world. It will have increased its funding to global bodies like the World Health Organization, enabling it to win leadership posts and rewriting the rules in its favor. And we will have facilitated that process. So that's the background. Now let's talk about the specifics of what's in this package. And this point, I want to make really clear, and I made this point in the Appropriations Committee. There were a bunch of controversial programs that precipitated this effort to cut USAID. 2 points to be made. One, the total dollar amount of all the controversial programs was like in the $100 to $200 million range. That's number one. Number two is all of those programs were discontinued. This is a budget that was enacted in March. This is Trump's budget. This is Trump's State Department. This is Trump's U.S. Agency for International Development. And so there is not a single thing that was on that Foxchiron that Marco Rubio is continuing to do. So this rescissions package doesn't have any of that stuff. And by the way, some of my Republican colleagues who understandably weren't super engrossed in the details, I had to send them a line by line of what these rescissions do, and they're sitting there going, where's the opera in Ecuador? Where's the cultural exchange program or the parade in South Africa? Where's all the goofy sounding stuff? And the answer is, a lot of that stuff was made up in the first place, but even if you stipulate to the idea that there was inappropriate spending, it's literally not in this package. What's in this package is stuff that I wouldn't say every, 90 out of 100 of us have asked for. And what do I mean by that? I mean, as the ranking member of the State and Foreign Ops Subcommittee, basically as a chair or ranking member of any of the subcommittees, you get a bunch of letters from your colleagues saying, this program's important to me, could you please take care of it in the coming appropriation cycle? And so now these letters are private, and I will protect the confidentiality of these interactions, but suffice it to say, a lot of the people voting for the rescissions are also privately asking for me to fund the thing that they are defunding. So this is all about the momentum that came from Doge and Trump and some tweets and some animus, real animus, to the foreign aid enterprise. So let's go through what's in it. $4.15 billion for economic support and development assistance. Our economic and development assistance is not charity. It is for countering the influence of the People's Republic of China or promoting regional stability. This work is in our economic and security interests. If this administration disagrees with some of the projects pursued by the previous administration, the good news is they have pretty broad authority to reprogram the money. Like if we're doing a program, I don't want to name a country because it'll have foreign policy implications. If we're doing a program in a country and this administration says, you know, that's not as important, they don't have to rescind the money. They can reprogram it to China or Russia or Ukraine or whatever it is. They have that flexibility. What they are saying is they want less money to counter foreign influence. $563 million for treaty dues. Now, we're members of organizations with whom we disagree. That's kind of the deal, right? Because if we want to be in an international forum, even arguing for our interests, even arguing against other countries or being frustrated with the body with which we're interacting, we have two choices. We can either participate, or if we don't pay our dues, we relegate ourselves to something called observer status, which basically means we're on the outside looking in. In order to get in the room, you got to pay your dues to the relevant organization. And that is what we're doing here. We're rescinding all the funds to all of the payments to all these international organizations. Why? Not because it's in our foreign policy interests. It's actually not. But because a bunch of ideologues don't actually understand how foreign policy works. And that's the thing here. You can have a different view under whatever it is to have an America first foreign policy. But this isn't that. This is just vandalism, right? I'm not having a disagreement with Jim Risch about how hawkish to be or how much to prioritize global health versus something else. We're just literally cutting off our nose to spite our face because what they want is vandalism to the enterprise. The tools of foreign policy are being shredded. So this isn't about policy unless you think the policy is, I wish my State Department were weaker. I wish the tools in our toolkit were more limited. I wish our ability to prevent war and keep nations stable were less well-funded. I wish that the only tool in our toolkit was military might. And it is not a small thing that many former secretaries of defense have said something along the lines of, if you defund foreign aid, I'm going to need more ammunition. Because this is the cheapest way to prevent war. $500 million from global health programs. Now, the new Republican proposal protects some of those programs funded by this account, but it leaves out pandemic prevention, family planning, and work on a wide range of issues. $1.3 billion for migration and refugee assistance and international disaster assistance. This funding supports our efforts to help refugees and other displaced people in conflict zones around the world. You know, most of us at some point, out of the 100 of us, do some sort of CODEL, some sort of foreign travel. And this is the kind of stuff we visit. And this is the stuff on a bipartisan basis that we all nod approvingly about. It's great that we're doing this. It's great that we're providing this kind of assistance. And $1.3 billion for refugee assistance is being cut. And I'll tell you why. It's because it's got the word refugee in it. I mean, that's how they figured out what they wanted to cut, right? They ran word searches. Like, they're pretending it's some sophisticated AI. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But all they were doing was looking for words like gender, or looking for words like climate, looking for words like equity, looking for words like refugee. And if the program was named in such a way that it just used those words, it was out. Just totally preposterous. Our contributions to and participation in organizations like UNICEF is being cut. I mean, good luck explaining why you cut UNICEF. Because I'm pretty good at imagining what my political competitors on the other side of the aisle would say. But why did you cut UNICEF? Like, are you trying to pretend that some number of hundreds of millions of dollars to prevent starvation among children is going to do the trick in terms of getting debt and deficits under control? Nobody actually believes that. Why are you cutting UNICEF? If this is about tightening our belts, why would you cut UNICEF? $460 million for the assistance for Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia. This account funds a whole bunch of bipartisan foreign policy priorities, including energy security in Ukraine, that will be cut completely if this recision is enacted. If there were programs under the previous administration that the current administration disagrees with, good news. They literally have the authority to reprogram those dollars. This is 2-year money. It doesn't actually have to be spent by the end of the federal fiscal year. They have pretty good authority to reprogram it, but they don't want to reprogram it to something that they consider important. They want to shred the enterprise. $125 million for the U.S. Agency for International Development operating expenses. Now, this administration is illegally dismantling USAID and functionally merging it under the State Department. Here's the problem with this $125 million. And yes, it's admin expenses, and I've been in the nonprofit sector, and I've been in the grant-giving side, and nobody loves the idea of paying for administrative expenses, but I know for a fact the State Department didn't want this in the rescissions package, because now that they have merged USAID under the State Department, they literally don't have the money, and they've got to absorb a $125 million hit. $100 million for the transition initiatives and the complex crisis fund. This is flexible funding in contingency accounts that didn't expire, and the administration can program it in any way they want. $83 million for the democracy fund. $83 million. Promoting democratic values is directly in our interest, and supporting resistance to dictators. Resistance to dictators. We're cutting resistance to dictators. Good for us. Make America great again. Ronald Reagan would be proud. The party of cold warriors, the party that vanquished the Soviet Union, the party that claims a hawkish mantle is now saying, you know what? This thing, which is probably 0.00 whatever of the entire federal spend, and an even tinier amount of the debt and deficit of the United States, let's defund that, because it's none of our business if dictators maintain power. It's a real change in policy. here. $27 million for the Inter-American Foundation. This provides small, cost-effective grants and technical support for locally led development projects. Strengthening stability and self-reliance in partner countries is in our interest. And this is another one that I get a lot of letters from these guys saying, please fund it. Dear Chairman Graham and Ranking Member Schatz, this program is super important, and would you please fund it in the next appropriation cycle? That's the private letter that we get. The public action is to rescind the money. $22 million for the African Development Foundation. The administration says the African Development Foundation's work is duplicative of the State Department's work. But the kind of grants and technical support that the African Development Foundation provides is not available through the State Department. $15 million for the United States Institute of Peace, a creature of statute, a creature of one of the first senators from the great state of Hawaii, Mr. Sparky Matsunaga. The through line between all of this is that there's no correlation between the rationale provided by the administration for these cuts and what's actually in the package. And I've talked to Eric Schmidt, with whom I have a reasonable, functional working relationship, but we're like talking past each other, because every time I talk about what's actually in this package, he pivots back to what's actually not in this package and starts naming line items of things that are not in the 8-page rescissions bill. This is not the BBB, which took, I forgot how, 11 and a half hours to read. This thing is 8 pages. You can go and see there is no line item for $1.8 billion for operas and festivals and underwater basket weaving and whatever else nonsense people wanted to characterize as the U.S. foreign aid enterprise. This is economic support funds. This is global public health. This is humanitarian assistance. This is helping our friends in Jordan and elsewhere to maintain the basic stability so that there is not a conflagration in a region. That's what's in this package. That is what's being rescinded from this package. I understand that there is some obligation as a party member to oblige the requests of this party's president. I get it. But we are still a system with separate and co-equal independent branches of government. The problem is, if you don't assert your authority, you don't functionally have it. So it's true that we hold the purse strings. It's true that we're the Article 1 branch. It's true that we're in charge of whether a bill passes or not. But I will tell you, the thing that is most alarming to me is not the bad policy outcomes. And there are terrible policy outcomes. The thing that is most alarming to me is that I have not yet seen in the last 6 months, in this final term of Donald Trump, what I saw in the first term of Donald Trump, which is quietly, not rudely, not provocatively, but occasionally, this branch of government on a bipartisan basis stood up for itself. And those guys would say, look, we love you, Mr. Trump, we love you, Mr. President, but on this one, I can't be with you. And on BBB, I understand, like, it's very hard to reject the president's signature policy accomplishment. But this seemed like one where we could have gotten 4 no votes. This really did, to me, seem like one where it'd be a good opportunity to stand up to the president and just say, like, we're going to do the appropriating over here. Like, let me show you what Article 1 says and what Article 2 says, and we're going to defer to you on lots of matters, but not 100% of matters. And so my question is, if they're going to have the votes to enact this rescission package, when is it that Republicans are going to stand up for their own prerogatives? And why would you run for office? Would you put your family through all of that? Would you go through the difficulty of a campaign? Would you go through the difficulty of being a public figure and subject to scrutiny and criticism and all of the late nights and the kind of uncomfortable interactions and all that? It really is a sacrifice. It's certainly an honor, but it's also a sacrifice. Why would you do that if you don't get to make up your own mind? I don't pretend to be able to get into the mind or the position of a Republican colleague of mine. I'm from Hawaii. It's different. But I do think that there's a point at which it's just not worth it to give this guy every single thing that he wants. And it would be important, and it will age well, and your family will be happy, and your staff will be secretly happy, at least some of them, if at some point you establish that there are some limits to the executive branch's power. I yield the floor.
Senator from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to talk about two subjects, the first of which is the vote that will begin here in about an hour and a half, and that's on this rescissions bill. I've indicated, and I voted for the discharge petition and the motion to proceed last night. For those who may not know that process, voting for the discharge petition simply means that we took it out of committee. Voting for the motion to proceed simply means that we're now on the bill and we'll be considering amendments over the course of the next several hours to determine if we have member support to change the bill, to improve it from different people's perspectives. And I intend to vote for final passage at this time. I'm also looking at other amendments that maybe will make the bill better. But I also have to speak to the unique nature of this rescissions package so that we make sure that we get this right and we lay the groundwork for future rescissions. The only time that we've had a successful rescissions package in modern history was 1992. And that rescission, and by the way, for those who don't know what rescission is, it just simply means this funding will be cut. You will not be allowed to spend money in the administration. Well, in 1992, the successful rescissions package actually had significant cuts, but in every case, it had very detailed list of specific programs that were going to be cut. So then as members, when they proceeded in 1992, candidly, I wasn't even paying attention to politics back in 1992 at this level. But when they were proceeding with the rescissions package, they could look at a specific line item and come to the floor like we're going to do this afternoon and say, I don't like that line item. I'm going to see if I have enough support among my colleagues to take that one out. I'll end up voting for the rescission, but I want that out because I disagree that we should be cutting the funding. In an ideal world, that success in 1992 would have instructed the rescissions package we have before us today. But the reality is we don't have those details. I'm prepared to vote for this rescission package with the hope that I can trust those who are going to make the detailed decisions for about $7 billion of the total $9 billion rescission. About $2 billion of it is associated with National Public Radio, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. People have asked me, why wouldn't I try to vote on an amendment to cut that out? Because I believe that those organizations have drifted over time, that we probably at some point should provide funding to them, but I'm not going to fight that part of the rescission. It's at least we know exactly what it is. So members have to decide whether or not they're okay with it. I suspect we're going to find out there are some things that we're going to regret, some second and third order effects, and I suspect that when we do, we'll have to come back and fix it. Similar to what I'm trying to do with the bill I voted against a couple of weeks ago, the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, that I think we're going to have to go back and work on. But the remainder of the rescissions package really is at the top level. We have no earthly idea what specific cuts will occur. But I'm willing to give OMB and the President the benefit of the doubt that there are going to be responsible cuts. There's two kinds of areas that I'm going to be focused on in particular. There's an area that could lay the groundwork for the administration to cut roughly $200 million from a Ukraine support program. It's not the military support program. I appreciate what the President's doing in terms of finally getting to a point to where we're going to sustain support for Ukraine. This happens to be a program that some believe, if it's cut, could harm some of the non-military aid that we're providing Ukraine. I share that belief. Now, I've been told as late as yesterday that that will not be one of the cuts. And so I'm willing to move forward and vote on this bill on the assumption that that comes to pass. However, if we find out that some of these programs that we've communicated should be out of bounds, that advisors to the President decide that they're going to cut anyway, then there will be a reckoning for that. It won't be in this bill, but this is only a small bill. This is a $9 billion rescissions package, folks. We've been told that through DOGE, there should be $1 trillion or $2 trillion in savings. The reason why it's so important to get this rescissions bill right is because if confidences are betrayed with a $9 billion bill, do you really think you're going to have the support for wide open, trust us decision for future larger rescissions? In other words, if my confidence is betrayed here, then I won't vote for another rescissions bill unless we have that line item programming. But I'm willing to go through this exercise, and hopefully we can trust the administration to not go down the path that we've been assured that they won't, when they're given this broad ability to make up to about $7 billion in cuts. Now, some of them are obvious. People are going to say, well, tell us you're worried about, pick some sort of liberal program in some part of the world. Obviously, we're not. There's a lot of things that we can cut where scope creep or fraud or abuse exists. But ladies and gentlemen, some of these programs will have life impacts. I was in Kenya, in Nairobi, outside of Kenya. I was at a Sudanese refugee camp a couple of months ago. And what struck me in this refugee camp were these American signs in a maternal ward with children that had distended bellies. They had flies crawling all over them, expectant mothers sick. And they were thankful that they had that condition to bring their children to and to potentially get support for expectant mothers. They were thankful for those conditions that we would find abominable in this country. And they were willing to give the United States credit to give them those conditions. Those are the kinds of programs that I am imploring the administration to not touch when given the broad authority that they'll get with this bill. Because if they do, it could be the end to billions of dollars that we could potentially rescind if we don't do one of two things in this bill. Number one, get this authority and cut programs like I just described in Kenya or Ukraine. Or get this authority and betray a confidence with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle in a spending decision that was used to fund the government. We've got this year-end appropriation that we have to work on, September 30. We got to fund the government. Now, how likely is it that Democrats are going to come with us? The only way we can fund the government is to get at least 7 Democrats to vote with us at the end of September 30, or we could go into a shutdown. If I'm a Democrat and you're trying to get me to vote and get to a 60-vote threshold to fund the government, and you've just betrayed a prior agreement and a prior appropriation, what are the likelihood that they're going to do that? So if we don't get agreement, if I see any rescissions that are betraying a confidence that we as U.S. senators made to get the government funded, that's going to be a problem for me in the next rescissions bill. Now, somebody may say I'm showboating or doing something else by coming to the floor and doing this, but folks, I'm trying to protect this administration from itself in terms of future decisions that will make our job more difficult to govern here. I want the president to be successful with these rescissions packages. I want the people advising him to know how they execute will determine whether or not President Trump is ultimately successful. So, Mr. President, that's all I have to say about that, but I do have a brief comment before I relinquish the floor, and I apologize to my friend and colleague from New Hampshire. There's been some talk about potentially firing the Fed chair. And I think probably people need to be educated on how the Fed really only has two things that they need to do. They need to keep unemployment low, and they need to manage inflation. It's called the dual mandate. Now, some people may actually think that Chair Powell just has broad authority to set policies around that, and that by firing him or replacing him, then everything's good. That person can make good decisions that a given administration likes. Folks, there's something called the FOMC, which has 12 voting members and 7 members that come into the discussion when we're talking about policies around rates. 12 of them have to vote for a rate increase to occur. No one person, including the chair, can influence that unless there's a consensus. So if anybody thinks that firing Chair Powell is going to change their focus and their method on the dual mandate, simply they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know how this whole process works. And I hope they do. Because the consequence of firing a Fed chair just because political people don't agree with that economic decision will be to undermine the credibility of the United States going forward. And I would argue if it happens, you're going to see a pretty immediate response. And we've got to avoid that. Look, I've had problems with Chair Powell, but at the end of the day, I respect him and I respect the independence of the Fed. And if anybody thinks that it'd be a good idea for the Fed to become another agency within the administration subject to whatever the president's advisors want them to do, they're making a huge mistake, and they really need to study how that process works. Thank you, Mr. Chair. No.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. President. I come to the floor today as we consider a rescission package that would cancel billions of dollars in foreign assistance. It would make permanent the cuts that were carried out by DOGE earlier this year. That was when this administration gave Elon Musk the authority to put American foreign aid programs through the wood chipper. They justified those cuts by saying they would save money. But here we are, 6 months later. Not only have they passed a reconciliation bill that increases the national debt by more than $3 trillion, that shifts the financial burden to state and local governments. In New Hampshire, there is going to be a massive cost shift because of the passage of that bill. And for all the talk about saving money, I don't think DOGE has saved a dime. Earlier this spring, CBS News reported that the federal government has spent $200 billion more in its first 100 days this year than it did last year. And according to the Partnership for Public Service, DOGE's cuts could cost American taxpayers as much as $135 billion this year alone. And this rescissions package is no better. And the substitute that we've seen so far is a gimmick. It claims to preserve funding for global health programs like HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis. for agricultural research, for the Countering PRC Influence Fund, but it doesn't actually restore those funds. So a vote for the substitute is a vote to cut critical foreign assistance programs. And one thing is clear. While American diplomacy and foreign aid amount to less than 1% of our federal budget, the return on that investment delivers real dividends to American consumers and American businesses. As you can see, U.S. development assistance supports more than 100,000 U.S. jobs. This week, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee minority released a report that highlights what cutting these programs does. This is the report, Mr. President. I think you've seen it in the committee. It's called "The Price of Retreat: America Cedes Global Leadership to China." What has been done in these foreign assistance programs helps China expand its influence. Through research and staff travel and meetings with NGOs and foreign officials, the report shows that the Trump administration's cuts to the State Department, to foreign assistance, and to other programs directly threaten our national security and our prosperity. They severely undermine our ability to compete with our main adversary, China, and they do that both in the national security space and in the economic space. You know, Secretary Rubio said at his confirmation hearing that, and I quote, "The most potent and dangerous near-peer adversary this nation has ever confronted is China." It's true. The People's Republic of China presents the United States with a strategic challenge that is distinct from any in our nation's history. While our competition with China often seems distant from the United States, the reality is the outcome of this competition is deeply tied to our economy, to our security, and to our lives here at home. Because whether we're combating unfair trade practices and the theft of intellectual property, or we're stopping the flow of fentanyl into our communities, or protecting Americans from spying and cyber attacks, or helping U.S. companies stay ahead in developing batteries, electric vehicles, and AI, the stakes are very high, and the threat to our prosperity and our security is real. I don't think most Americans want to live in a world where the Chinese Communist Party is driving the agenda. But instead of strength and focus, what we've seen from this administration is a chaotic, haphazard retreat from the global stage. Excuse me. Oh, they talk a good game on the danger that China poses, but actions speak louder than words. And when it comes to confronting Beijing, this administration has no consistent message and no coherent strategy, and they are eliminating critical programs: disease surveillance and prevention, scientific research, disaster response, and now we just had a hearing in the Foreign Relations Committee, and we talked about this. The Trump administration is preparing to incinerate 500 tons of emergency food. 500 tons. And the cost of that food was $800,000. It's already been paid for by taxpayers. And it's going to cost another $130,000 to incinerate it. So talk about waste. That's enough food to feed 1.5 million children for a week. But thanks to chaotic and inept decisions, cutting funding, firing staff, gutting key programs, American taxpayers are going to foot the bill for this. And children are going to go hungry. These erratic, self-defeating policies are in stark contrast to what we're seeing from the Chinese Communist Party, which has been, sadly, very clear and deliberate in its strategy. Because the PRC is playing the long game. It's using tactics like disinformation, political interference, cyber attacks, and economic coercion. Within days of cuts to foreign aid programs, China was already labeling the United States as an unreliable partner. And within months, Beijing was replacing programs that we had cut. So look where we are today. We can look at the number of cuts to American embassies and consulates around the world. And while the administration proposes slashing America's international affairs budget by 84%, China is boosting its diplomatic budget by 8%. As we cut diplomatic staff and consider embassy closures, China operates one of the world's largest diplomatic missions with 278 missions. And while the U.S. shuts down networks like Radio Free Asia, China is spending billions on propaganda, expanding into 80 new frequencies and more languages. Our first hearing in the Foreign Relations Committee at the beginning of this year was on China. And what we heard at that hearing was that the PRC in China is spending more than $1 billion a year on misinformation and disinformation campaigns. And what have we done in response? We've cut Radio Free Asia. We've cut those networks that provide information to the people who China is trying to manipulate. So while we're cutting counter-narcotics programs, China's working with Latin American countries to build law enforcement capacity. And as the administration moves to defund international bodies like the UN, China's pledged more than $500 million to the World Health Organization. And, you know, it's so crazy. The administration has been attacking universities like Harvard and saying that they are not going to allow them to include any international students. And what's Hong Kong doing on behalf of the PRC? They're offering places to talented STEM students who are looking to leave the United States. And while we threaten allies with tariffs, China's courting them across Europe, Asia, and the Western Hemisphere. In May, Xi Jinping hosted Brazil's president and other Latin American leaders and pledged more than $9 billion in investments. I was with a group of senators at the Paris Air Show earlier this year. It's an exhibition that highlights the latest in aircraft and aerospace and military aircraft. And when we met with our embassy officials, they told us that they saw the biggest presence ever from China at that exhibition, and that China has opened 3 new consulates in France, over 20 Confucius Institutes in France. So China's not just looking at Africa, at the Indo-Pacific. They're looking at countries that have been our traditional allies. And what's the administration doing? It's suggesting that it's going to close U.S. diplomatic posts in these same regions. China is eating our lunch when it comes to diplomacy, when it comes to the investments that we need to make around the world. And yet, here we are today, we're considering a rescissions package that's going to further benefit the Chinese Communist Party. Leaders across the political spectrum, Democrats and Republicans alike, have agreed since I got to the United States Senate, and I thought the administration agreed with us, that the biggest threat to America's security, both economic and national security, is China, the People's Republic of China. We need to come together. We need to make sure that America doesn't retreat from the global stage. And the good news is that despite the cuts, despite the administration policies, there is still broad bipartisan agreement that American leadership on the global stage is essential, and that China's expanding global footprint makes us less safe and less prosperous. So to my colleagues here in Congress who are considering this rescissions package that will codify these cuts, remember this: it's not too late. We can move to reverse the damage that's been done in the first 6 months. We can preserve America's ability to lead, to compete, and to shape the future on America's terms, not on the terms of the Chinese Communist Party. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, 8 times since 1974, when Congress created the rescissions process, one party has controlled the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. 8 times. It's actually 4 times Democratic control and 4 times Republican control. 8 times one party had total control over the elements of the federal government necessary to pass legislation. And never before has either party done what Republicans are doing today: pass a partisan rescissions bill, double-crossing the minority party and canceling spending that just months before both parties shook hands on. Why? Why has this never happened before? Well, because this is just an old-fashioned double cross. It's a con job. Republicans and Democrats agreed on spending levels. First, in a bipartisan appropriations bill passed in March of 2023, and then again in multiple bipartisan continuing resolutions. When a party controls the White House and both houses of Congress, it always has the power to use the rescissions process to pull a fast one, to agree with the minority party on a budget, because the rules say that you need 60 votes to pass a budget, to get majority party priorities funded in exchange for funding minority party priorities, and then to use the rescissions process to just double-cross the minority by using that process, which only requires 50 votes, to just then cancel the minority party's priorities. That's immoral. It's unethical. Suckering your partner into a deal in which you get something and they get something, and then using the back door to cancel the part of the deal that you don't like. That's bad faith. It's why no party has done it since 1972. The power has always existed. 8 different times, either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party could have cut a bipartisan spending deal and then used the rescissions power to just cancel the parts of the deal they don't like, but it's never happened because it's bad faith, because it destroys the ability of the Senate to function in a bipartisan way. It's kind of like if you traded baseball cards as a kid, and you made a trade with your best friend, and then in the middle of the night you snuck into his house and you took your cards back so that you had his cards, and now you had your cards as well. Nobody would think that's right. But that's exactly what's happening here. It will become hard, maybe even impossible, and Senator Till has laid this out very well, to write a bipartisan budget ever again, because the minority party now knows that they can get double-crossed. And believe me, if Republicans do this now, Democrats are going to do it when they're in charge. This will become the norm. Sit down, do a bipartisan deal, wink, wink, and then a couple months later, just cancel the agreement through a partisan rescissions process. And of course, this is now the 3rd time in 7 short months that the new Republican majority has made substantial, meaningful changes to Senate rules and norms. Senate Republicans created a brand new rule that massively expands their ability to invalidate actions of the previous Democratic administration. Just A couple weeks ago, Republicans walked away from decades of precedent on how Senate bills are scored, and they used new magic math to create a score that hid the actual cost of their budget bill. And now this double cross. But, Mr. President, this isn't just about breaking the Senate. That's actually probably the least serious consequence of what is happening here. The most serious consequence is what is happening to American power around the world as Donald Trump and Republicans, in part through this rescissions bill, destroy every single non-military tool that we use around the world to protect our interests. When I was like 8 or 9 years old, I collected G.I. Joe figures, and one Christmas, I remember being so excited because Santa Claus brought me the huge G.I. Joe aircraft carrier. It was awesome. I was obsessed with the military, like a lot of boys that age, the planes, the tanks, the ships. That's what I thought American power was, the U.S. military, period, stop. And of course, that's an 8-year-old view of the world. The world, as it turns out, is a lot more complicated. You need a lot more than just planes and tanks and ships to protect your interests. You need a powerful military. But adults, in particular adults who have any experience in national security, know that the octopus of global power has a lot of arms. Military might, but also information might, economic might, diplomatic might, energy might, humanitarian might. This revisions bill cancels billions of dollars in investments in non-military foreign policy tools. And it is part of a broader effort by the Trump administration to destroy almost every tool that protects American interests other than our military. Over the last 10 years, the defense budget has grown from about $502 billion to $825 billion. That's an extraordinary 10-year increase of about $323 billion. Over that same period of time, the State Department budget has grown from $54 billion to $56 billion, a $2 billion increase. Now, if you layer in emergency funds, that increase is more like $30 billion, but you are still talking about an increase for the military over the past 10 years that is 10 times the size of the increase for non-military tools. And this military myopia, it makes me remember my 8-year-old self because it is so childish. It's so immature. It is so divorced from reality. Donald Trump's national security strategy, fund the military and destroy every other way that we confront Russia, China, Iran, non-state actors, it could have been constructed by an 8-year-old. It's that unsophisticated, and it really amounts to surrender. Because as we stop projecting non-military power around the world, China and Russia, but especially China, they just celebrate and step into the void. Secretary Rubio announced on March 10th that 83% of USAID programs would be terminated. Meanwhile, China just announced an 8.4% increase in its own diplomatic budget for 2025, committing $500 million additional dollars to the World Health Organization over the next 5 years, an organization that the United States no longer belongs to. As a result of our cuts, standing next to China's investments in diplomatic power, China will surpass the United States this year for the first time as the largest bilateral assistance partner for 40 countries. China is now the power at the World Health Organization. They call the shots about the standards of global health and pandemic relief. China is now the preferred economic development partner for many nations. China is now the dominant force in standard-setting boards for global commerce. This is a choice the Trump administration is making to make China, and to a certain extent Russia in certain forums, the dominant power when it comes to economic statecraft, information statecraft, energy statecraft. Let me give you a specific example. Today, information is power. If you control information flows, man, you control politics, you control economics, you control culture. China spends about $7 billion a year to promote their communist narrative, to undermine U.S. leadership around the world and foster a China-friendly media environment globally. Russia, it's really hard to know how much Russia spends because they're not publicly reporting much of it, but they certainly spend at least $1.5 billion, but probably double that. And in many countries, Russia and China just control the information space. Russian-backed candidates win elections in countries on their periphery simply because of Russian information programs. Asian countries box the United States and U.S. companies out of economic competition because of Chinese information programs. And so, faced with China and Russia spending somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 billion, when the United States today is spending only a fraction of that amount of money, it would stand to reason that this would be a moment where we should come together, Republicans and Democrats, and dramatically increase our information warfare investments. But of course, we're doing exactly the opposite. Trump is in the middle of a purposeful, relentless campaign to destroy America's global information power. The Trump administration just shut down the Global Engagement Center. That is the capacity at the State Department to try to counter Russian and Chinese propaganda around the world. Gone, just gone. Global Engagement Center, bipartisan commitment, set up years ago by myself and Rob Portman, supported by Marco Rubio when he was a senator, now just doesn't exist any longer. The administration is dismantling the U.S. Agency for Global Media. That's the umbrella arm that oversees our information programs around the world. They laid off 92% of its staff. Voice of America, the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, they are on track to disappear. The arm of the VOA that combats Iranian anti-American information, gone. 54 different radio frequencies operated by Radio Free Asia to counter Chinese anti-American propaganda, gone. At the same time, China is opening up 80 new radio frequencies in multiple languages, including in those regions where America is disappearing. We are handing the world to China and Russia by deciding to view American power only through a military lens. And this rescissions bill makes it worse by enacting billions of dollars of cuts to diplomacy, to economic development programs, likely to information programs, because we actually can't see the impact of all of these cuts. It's all surrender. China is throwing a blowout party as we disappear our non-military power from the world. Trump terminated tens of millions of dollars in projects to upgrade Africa's power grid. What did China do? They announced $50 billion of new financing for Africa. Africa, a place where the critical minerals exist to power AI and future defense systems. Africa, the part of the world whose economy is going to explode with opportunity, now opportunity that will go to Chinese companies, not American companies, as we withdraw our relationships with that continent as China steps into the breach. This revisions bill, standing next to Trump's destruction of all of our non-military foreign policy tools, it's surrender to our enemies. This bill is a double cross. It is. It's a double cross. It's going to harm our ability to ever be able to do a bipartisan budget process in the future. But even worse, this bill is surrender to our adversaries who are chomping at the bit to fill the void that we are creating by adopting the national security strategy of an 8-year-old boy.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, it was just a few weeks ago right here on this Senate floor that our Republican colleagues on a straight party line vote cut millions and millions of dollars, billions of dollars back from investments in healthcare like Medicaid. And as a result, millions and millions of Americans are going to lose access to healthcare. And for what? All for a giant giveaway, tax giveaway that disproportionately benefits the very wealthiest in America. They called it the big, beautiful bill. It was beautiful if you're a billionaire. For everybody else, it came at your expense in one form or another. Now, here today on the floor of the Senate, we have Republicans bringing a partisan bill once again. This time to cut $9 billion in important investments, including from public radio and public television. And as my colleague, Senator Murphy, just indicated, from very important foreign assistance programs that are essential to American diplomacy and ultimately to American power and interests around the world. This is not America first. This is America in retreat, or President Trump surrendering. So, to add insult to injury, these cuts are coming after Republicans in this very body and the House of Representatives passed and President Trump signed into law provisions that included the very programs that we're talking about cutting today. In other words, this is a total switcheroo where one day Republicans vote for a package that includes essential investments, and the next day they turn around on a party line vote and erase the investments that were just signed into law. That will undermine the entire appropriations process. Now, I've been listening to comments from some of my Republican colleagues, and they say this is about reducing the national debt. Well, I am all for reducing our deficits and our debt. But I asked my Republican colleagues, if you really cared about fiscal responsibility and deficits in the debt, what happened 2 weeks ago on the floor of the Senate? Because Republican senators pulled all-nighters in order to pass legislation that resulted in the largest debt increase in American history, throwing away trillions of dollars to in part pay for tax cuts for billionaires. That bill that passed the Senate just 2 weeks ago will add $4 trillion to our national debt. Why is that? Because even after they made cuts to Medicaid, which will throw millions of Americans off their health care, even after that, the tax cuts that disproportionately benefit wealthy people were so big that it's still going to explode the deficit by $4 trillion. And now here they come 2 weeks later to pass this rescissions bill that cuts very important services and very important components of our foreign policy for $9 billion. Mr. President, that is 0.23 of 1% of the debt that the Republican senators voted to increase just 2 weeks ago. So nobody's fooling anybody when senators come down to the floor and say, we've got to do this because of our national debt, having exploded the national debt by $4 trillion just 2 weeks ago. And so what does this package include? Well, it includes cuts to public radio. That includes NPR, includes PBS, also public television is cut. So we explode the debt by $4 trillion 2 weeks ago, and this week we're coming after Big Bird. That is their solution to dealing with the national debt. If you look at the cuts to public radio, they can have very harmful impacts around the country. Because in many rural areas especially, people do use access to public radio to get alerts about natural disasters. So this would put those communities at risk, and this is part of a pattern. It's part of a pattern we're seeing in the funds being withheld by this Trump White House that we've already passed. Here we're talking about cutting funds through this partisan process, but the Trump White House is also unilaterally withholding important funds for disaster relief. We learned after the tragic flooding in Texas that claimed so many lives that FEMA failed to answer nearly 2/3 of the calls on its disaster assistance line because the Trump administration had cut so much of the FEMA staff. In my state of Maryland, a number of months ago, we witnessed terrible flooding in the western part of our state. In fact, some of you may have seen the images of elementary school students being evacuated from their school on boats. Fortunately, no one died in that flood, but the damage was extensive. And we're still waiting on the Trump administration to answer our state request for some help for those families and small businesses that were hit. Now, this is a pattern that goes beyond just disaster relief. In Maryland, we've also seen cuts to FEMA programs designed to protect communities and let them have the resources to put in place protections like higher walls so that they are not victims of natural disasters. Those funds were cut. So we see those cuts to those essential programs. We're also seeing this across the board when it comes to global health. And I'm not going to go through all of those cuts. Some of my colleagues have identified those. I will just say that our foreign assistance is not charity. Our foreign assistance, as colleagues have said, has been an essential element of our overall foreign policy. And if you talk to wise generals at the Defense Department, they will tell you that our national security and foreign policy strategy rests on 3 pillars. Yes, of course, defense and military power, but also diplomacy and development. And when you make these deep cuts that are impacting diplomacy and development, including, by the way, the 1,300 patriotic State Department employees who were just fired last week, when you do that, it's our adversaries who benefit, and it's the American people who lose, along with our allies. Because those are not giveaways, those investments. You know, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't just sit in your house and let your neighbor's house burn. You go help them out because they're your neighbor and it's the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do because that fire may be heading to your house next. And when it comes to issues like global health and the spread of disease around the world, it's the same story. We save millions of lives, including millions of kids' lives, when we help, but we also prevent those diseases from jumping over the oceans and coming to hurt people right here in the United States of America. But this administration doesn't care. If you look at a Lancet study, they've estimated that the cuts that the Trump administration is made in the area of global health and other important investments will cost 14 million lives by the year 2030, including 4.5 million children who will die. We just saw a story in Atlantic that revealed that the Trump administration is paying to incinerate, to light on fire, 500 tons of emergency nutritional biscuits that could go to feed hungry kids. So, Mr. President, I really urge my colleagues to take a step back and not move forward with these cuts. As I said, the notion that this is somehow their contribution to reducing our national debt when they exploded our national debt by $4 trillion over 10 years just 2 weeks ago is ludicrous. But I will close, since I see the Vice Chair of the Appropriations Committee on the floor, with just a final point that does deserve repeating, which is we've had a bipartisan appropriations process. We've done our very best to preserve that tradition. But when you take an action on one day and we vote on a bipartisan basis for important American priorities, whether in public radio or addressing global health issues, when we do that one day and the President of the United States signs that into law, and then we run down here a few months later and said, you know what, we didn't mean it with respect to these programs, and we, on a partisan basis, are going to yank them away, that undermines trust and confidence in this entire system. So both for the American people and the important investments that we did make and which they will now lose, but also for the future of this institution and the power of the purse, I urge my colleagues to vote against this bill. And I yield the floor.
Senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the following senators be permitted to speak prior to votes: myself for up to 10 minutes, Senator Cantwell for up to 10 minutes, Senator Murray for 5 minutes, and Senator Schumer for 5 minutes.
Without objection.
Jesus wept. Jesus wept. Most of us who grew up in Bible-believing households know this is the shortest verse in all of Scripture, and in some ways, the most powerful. One that haunts me. Jesus wept in John the 11th chapter, 35th verse, because he had come too late, seemingly, to save the life of Lazarus. He wept because someone he knew and loved had died, and it had caused such harm and loss to his family. Today, we are doing something on this floor of this Senate. My Republican colleagues are doing something on the floor of this Senate that I believe would make Jesus weep. In Luke, there's a moment in the 10th chapter where a lawyer, and it's always a lawyer, comes to test Jesus. And trying to justify himself, presses Jesus with questions. What must I do to gain eternal life? And Jesus says, what does the Scripture teach? And he says, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. And the second commandment is like unto it, you should love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says, you have read well. Do this and you will gain eternal life. But the lawyer, hoping to be justified, says, but wait, who is my neighbor? And what follows is the well-known parable of the Good Samaritan, where the righteous, the priestly, the respected, the powerful walk on the other side of the road when they encounter someone who's been set upon by robbers. Not my problem, not my neighbor. But in the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's this person, a Samaritan, from a disfavored ethnicity, someone outside the circle of concern to the ancient Israelites who does the right thing. This parable would have been shocking at the time that it was preached by Jesus. The idea that the good neighbor was the outcast, the unexpected, would be something that frankly would have been a surprise. So although today being a good Samaritan is a common term, it's important to know the history. We are taught as children that we are to see all as our neighbors, not just those who live next door, not just those who look like us or speak like us or pray like us, but the widest possible definition of neighbor is what we are called through righteousness to see in the world. And what a difference it has made. Because our nation has for decades embraced the cause of being present, of caring, of making life-saving differences to young mothers and children, to widows and orphans, to the imprisoned, to the hungry, to the refugee, to those fleeing oppression, to those seeking relief from authoritarian governments, for those seeking a better way. We are all God's children, and from childhood we are taught that the golden rule, which appears in virtually every religion, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, is the very foundation of the goodness of America. That we care for each other as neighbors, and we care for the world as neighbors. Yes, we are the most charitable, giving, philanthropic, engaged nation on earth. And yet all that we do in foreign aid is 1%, less than 1% of our total federal budget. Months ago, when Elon Musk and Doge began roaming about the federal agencies of our government, their first target was that delivers disaster relief, that helps feed the hungry, that helps welcome the refugee, that helps stabilize countries going through turmoil. They laid off thousands, they shut down programs, they canceled billions. And yet here today, we are at it again. Republicans are proposing even deeper cuts. I want to talk about one area of the many that will be cut, I fear, later today. Disaster assistance. Our nation's been riveted as we've watched the tragedy that unfolded in the Texas Hill Country, where a raging river killed dozens and dozens of innocent children. And you know, around the world, when disaster strikes, it is the Americans who show up first. It is Americans who show up with relief, with assistance, with skill and talent and ability. It's been this way for decades, and it should be this way still. I was on a bipartisan trip to the Philippines just a few months ago with Senator Ricketts. And I was struck to learn that the Philippines, of all the nations on earth, is the most prone to natural disasters. They value our partnership, our alliance. We've been security partners for decades. There's many Filipino Americans. There's a close and deep relationship. But in meeting with their national leaders, their elected leaders, their senators and their ministers of their cabinet, they said, you know, it makes an incredible difference here in the Philippines. Every time there's a typhoon, there's an earthquake, there's a volcano, it's the Americans who come. It's the Americans who deliver the aid, who help us help ourselves with training and equipment and support. And you know, in the excess of Doge's deep cuts, they fired and laid off most of our experts who are capable of delivering world-class disaster relief. We saw the consequences with an earthquake in Myanmar just 3 months ago, where the few remaining folks who did this work were laid off as they were deployed. And instead, the response was led by the Chinese. We are driving nations into the open arms of our adversaries. We have long been known as a nation that sought to be respected, admired, believed in, embraced, not for the example of our power, but by the power of our example. That when there were dread pandemics killing millions, America showed up. One of the positives of this day is that my Republican colleagues have recoiled from fully shutting down PEPFAR, and that is a positive. One of the best things we've ever done as a nation is to save 27 million lives across the world that otherwise would have been lost to HIV/AIDS. But I'll tell you, when Ebola raged across Africa in 2014, I was the one member of Congress who went to Liberia. At the request of the president, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, a brave and proud leader of a nation struggling, facing massive losses of life. Projections at the early stages of the Ebola pandemic were that a fifth to a quarter of their population would die in a matter of weeks. And who came to help? The Americans. Catholic Relief Services, Save the Children, CARE, the U.S. military, our public health service. I'll never forget meeting a young Liberian named Alvin. He dropped out of college to become a physician's assistant to help when the outbreak began, and he, in caring for patients himself, contracted Ebola, a near certain death sentence. Yet Alvin was evacuated by Americans to the Ebola treatment center set up and funded and equipped by Americans, and his life was saved by Americans. Whether it was the president of the nation, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, or Alvin, the folks I met on that trip to Liberia thanked and praised the American people for our decency, our kindness, our seeing them as our neighbor in their moment of deepest struggle, risk, and loss. And yet today, my colleagues would rather trim 0.1% of the budget, $9 billion, to cut deeper into food aid and disaster assistance and fighting pandemics, all to justify a tax cut. I can think of few more despicable acts on this floor in my 15 years. I can speak to process. We have a bipartisan appropriations process where we can and should debate and consider these further cuts and put them on the floor and vote them up. But this is an odd thing. It's a recision. It's a cutting back further of money we've already appropriated. Just a few minutes later today, I will be trying to get votes to end $465 million of further cuts in disaster assistance that'll be on the floor today. Taking money from the World Food Program and UNICEF, from Red Cross and Save the Children, from Catholic Relief Services and World Vision. Folks may think at home that this money that goes out to the world is money better spent here. But for the pennies on the federal dollar that we spend responding to disasters around the world, organizations we all know and a majority of us believe in and support, like the Red Cross, World Vision, or Catholic Relief Services, are able to appear in time and deliver life-saving aid. Think about what we are doing. Think about the example we are setting. Think about what we are teaching our children. Open your hearts and eyes and realize what we are about to do. This is a nation of which I am so proud. And yet at times it does things of which I am so ashamed. I cannot imagine the faces in the refugee camps, in the villages, in the clinics, in the schools, in the towns, in the cities around the world, who for years have been used to the idea that when there's a pandemic, the Americans come. That when there's an earthquake, the Americans come. That when there is starvation, the Americans come. Today we will vote, no, we won't. We are more interested in ourselves and in a bigger tax cut than we are in saving starving children. People laid low by the devastation of an earthquake. Families separated by a typhoon. The best part of this nation, what truly makes us great, is our selfless giving to others. We will be judged by how we act today. For God's justice is swift and sure. And I tremble when I think about the answer this chamber will give today to the question, who is my neighbor? Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, we should turn aside. We should not, with this act and this vote today, make Jesus weep. Thank you, Mr. President. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we are about to vote on this package, but I wanted to first make sure my colleagues understood that we are not just voting on whether local news stations shut down, or whether communities can get information in an emergency, or whether or not America retreats on the world stage and breaks its word, or whether or not we let children die of hunger and preventable diseases just to save a few pennies. All of that is at stake here, but there is a lot more at stake as well, like whether we allow partisan rescissions to cut bipartisan funds for the first time ever. Colleagues, to understand that, for the first time ever. Or whether Russ Vote can steamroll this body, and whether Republicans will pass a bill of cuts when they don't even know what is in it. I mean, really, I have heard members complain to high heaven about not having time to read a bill before voting on it. Well, this is even worse. The administration has outright refused to tell us what will get cut if Republicans pass this bill. Even the Republican leader admits that. This is a Pandora's box of cuts. So what I want to leave my colleagues with is this. We are not just voting on the devastating cuts in this package. We are also voting on how the Senate is going to spend the rest of the year. Are we just going to do rescission after rescission? Because we know Russ Vote is just itching to send us more. And if, as you have all seen throughout this process, and as we have seen at every hearing we have had with him, he doesn't care if you feel steamrolled. He doesn't care if you want more details. He doesn't care whether you want different cuts. So the vote before us right now is really about, do we, our elected representatives, all of us, want to write the laws and even consider targeted rescissions in those bills? Do we want to have time to move them on the floor, or do we want to spend every day, every week, here debating how much of the last spending bill to unravel and whose communities get robbed? This will not be a hard vote for me, and it really should not be a hard vote for any one of us. Mr. President, I am a strong no, and I hope all of our colleagues will join us. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
President.
Democratic leader.
Mr. President, in a few moments, we will begin voting on amendments to the Republican rescissions package. Let's start with the devastating consequences of passing this bill as written. The bill will starve local news and radio stations, so essential, particularly in rural areas, for people hearing about weather events. We learned the tragedy of untimely notification in Texas recently. It was very terrible. Could happen again with these kinds of cuts. The bill will harm America's farmers and researchers and businesses, make the world an easier place, unfortunately, for terrorist recruitment, and reward Communist China and Vladimir Putin, all so Republicans can keep paying for billionaire tax breaks. And the most galling part, Republicans are rushing forward without a clue how these unhinged cuts will be implemented. That's not just me expressing an opinion. That's what Republicans themselves admit. That's what the chair of the Appropriation Committee admits. That's what the majority leader admitted today, that Republicans don't even know how OMB and DOJ are going to rearrange these cuts, and yet they're voting for it. Republicans are putting a blindfold over their own eyes and leading rural Americans off a cliff just to make Donald Trump and his billionaire friends happy. Well, Democrats are not here to merely rubber stamp whatever Donald Trump does like the Republicans are doing. Today, my Senate Democratic colleagues and I will make clear the damage this package will have on Americans and on our national security. For one, we'll expose the terrible things Republicans have stuffed in this bill. They want to starve local news stations, defund local radio stations, cripple disaster alerts, abandon native tribes, isolate rural Americans, and erode America's leadership on the world stage. These amendments will show how the Republican bill makes America weaker while making our adversaries stronger. I, for one, will push an amendment on the floor stopping Republicans from cutting funds necessary to resist the Chinese Communist Party, beat them in the race for precious minerals vital to our new technologies, and prevent them from spreading their nefarious cyber attacks around the world. My amendment will also stop Republicans from cutting vital funds to our partners in the Indo-Pacific, who are the first line of defense against aggression from Communist China. We'll also be ready to offer amendments that take Republicans to task when they claim they want to improve this bill, but only offer tweaks that look good on paper without solving the issues they claim to care about. For example, Republicans say they want to protect rural communities, so we have amendments that will actually stand up to rural communities instead of making cosmetic tweaks at the margin that Republicans might try to push. Republicans say they stand with local TV and radio stations and want to protect those communities from cuts, so we have amendments that will actually halt these awful cuts and keep the places whole. Not some commitment to one state, to one state, and one senator from OMB, but actually preventing these cuts from cutting across America. Republicans say they want to stand up to the Chinese Communist Party, to get tough on Putin, to protect funding from global disease and preventing the spread of terrorism. So we have amendments that will ensure these vital programs are not cut. If Republicans oppose these common sense amendments, they are simply not serious about protecting local communities and the foreign aid they profess to care about. Democrats will also push amendments to mitigate its harms on local communities and prevent Republicans from unilaterally eviscerating funds that benefit tens of millions of people. The matter is very simple. Republicans themselves have admitted that this bill, as written right now, is a black box of cuts, and they have no idea how these cuts will be implemented. So if they're serious, really serious, about standing up for local TV and radio, if they truly care about national security, if they say they want to protect communities from harmful cuts, they should prove it. Prove it today by supporting our amendments. Actions speak a heck of a lot louder than words. I yield the floor. The absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
Mr. President.
Senator from
I
Washington.
ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, while we're waiting for our colleague to come, if I could, remarks, my colleague, I so appreciate Senator Murray and Leader Schumer out here speaking on these important issues. But as a committee who's thought a lot about storms lately, we're not just putting PBS at risk here, we're putting millions of Americans who depend on local media for life-saving information. And what's in this rescission request is really making sure that public broadcasters don't have that ability, at least in 20 states where they have emergency plans. So what happens is that NPR manages public radio satellite systems. They receive emergency alerts. They tell us to get out of the way. PBS operates those warning, alert, and response networks, which then transmits over 11,000 emergency alerts alone last year, a 30% increase from the previous year. So why are we talking about cutting off emergency alerts? That's 1,000 times these stations were warned to tell people that their lives were in danger. Let me explain what PBS's warning system means for American families in plain English. When emergency managers, such as someone at FEMA or the National Weather Service or local officials, hit send on a life-saving alert, it normally travels through wireless carriers' infrastructure to reach cell towers. But what happens when those cyber attacks or those infrastructures are crippled? When the fiber lines don't work or they're cut in a storm, when disaster like fire or flood or hurricane knocks them out, what happens to the communication infrastructure then? Well, that's what PBS Warn does. It fills in. PBS stations also on the radio through the airwaves, because they don't have to rely on physical infrastructure, they basically communicate to more than 340 PBS stations nationwide. These stations running on backup generators are built to broadcast through disasters. I mean, I think if anybody's got any history to them, they realize that there has been lots of life-saving information over the airwaves. So local infrastructure like TV receivers, local regional facilities grab that alert signal from the PBS broadcast, no internet required, and they get the information out to us. This system and these critical alerts are the primary thing that we use in the nation when everything else goes dark. That means that every PBS transmitter becomes a backup lifetime line for emergency alerts, ensuring that warnings about tornadoes, fires, floods, and evacuations reach your cell phone in seconds. Just think about that. If you have this flood we had in Kerrville and you don't have a communication system, the PBS system is the one that sends the alerts because they've gotten it through the airwaves. This administration and my colleagues now want to pull the plug on this. Just look at yesterday's alerts alone on flash flooding in North Carolina, in Central Texas, in Arizona, a statewide missing person alert in Kentucky, a tornado warning across Nebraska, South Dakota, and Wisconsin, and double and dozens more. Why would we want anybody to miss a disaster alert? It could even be about boiling water and making sure that you have the right water. These are all important communication systems, and they're important when cell phones and the internet don't work. On November 30th, 2018, a magnitude 7.1 earthquake shook south central Alaska. In Anchorage, roads split apart, buildings crumbled, power lines snapped, cell towers went down within seconds, and people panicked as they tried to reach loved ones. The internet failed. But Alaska public media never stopped broadcasting. Operating on backup power, they immediately activated their emergency protocols. As the aftershocks, including a 5.7 tremor, continued to rock the region, APM provided real-time updates on road closures, school evacuations, and tsunami warnings. They broadcast which bridges had been damaged, where emergency shelters had opened, most critically assured isolated communities that the help was on the way. For thousands of Alaskans, that familiar voice on radio was their only connection to vital information during the most terrifying memories that they have had. In a letter to the editor of the Anchorage Daily News, one person wrote, quote, "Commercial radio may be helpful down south, but rural Alaska is different. Pick any rural Alaskan community with exposure to these dangers, and you will find probably that they don't have a commercial radio station. They probably do receive the NPR station." In rural Alaska, they continued, there is no market-driven solution to ensure emergency broadcasts are available in a disaster. That reoccurs on a 100-year scale time, end quote. So it's not just Alaska that has this problem. Consider what happened in Kentucky during the historic tornadoes in December of 2021, when the devastating EF4 tornado carved a 160-mile path of destruction on one of the longest tornado tracks in our nation's history. WKMS Public Radio became the sole source of news for thousands of Kentuckians. As the tornado ripped through Mayfield, at 9:30 destroying the town's candle factory with 110 people stuck inside. Commercial power failed across western Kentucky. And those cell towers toppled, the internet connections vanished. And WKMS kept broadcasting on a backup power, guiding search and rescue teams through darkness. It is time that my colleagues understand that, in the words of station managers, quote, in these kinds of moments, your emergency radio or your car radio is literally the only thing to have to get you life, to get you any news or a lifeline, end quote. I ask my colleagues, please do not cut off emergency broadcast funding. How could you possibly think that's a wise idea in the events that we are facing in our nation? I thank the President. I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
Senator from Missouri.
Are we in a quorum call, Mr. President?
Yes, we are.
I would ask for unanimous consent to suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are here today and we're about to begin Vote-A-Rama. Vote-A-Rama. We seem to do this quite a bit these days, but we're here today to do it on a very, very important bill, the rescissions package from President Trump. I spoke yesterday, and I won't go on for as long as I did yesterday about what this is all about. What this bill is about is to test the will of this chamber if we can actually move forward on what the American people sent us here to do, which is to find waste, to find fraud, and find abuse, and also to realign the taxpayer dollars that go out the door with actual American interests. So we're going to have a lot of conversations about the foreign aid spending. And it's been certainly highlighted, as it should be, some of the ridiculousness and craziness. And my friend from Hawaii has talked about, well, that's not going to happen anymore. Well, good, we don't need the money for it. But let's make sure it never happens again by sending a message that this chamber can actually see what happened and course correct. $18 million to gender diversity in the Mexican street lighting industry. $2.4 million to make international disaster aid more considerate of sexual orientation and gender identity. $2.2 million to reduce xenophobia towards Venezuelan migrants. $3 million for Iraqi Sesame Street, and $33 million for UN programs like funding for transgender tampons in Bangladesh, LGBTQ campaigns in Rio, and third gender community centers in Southeast Asia. If you're listening to this, if you're watching this, that is offensive. And that's just a short laundry list of the ways in which these bureaucrats have betrayed the trust of the American people. So what is today about? It is our effort to try to restore not only just some fiscal sanity to this place that everybody has talked about, even across the aisle, hopefully, maybe, I don't know, but not just that, but the political will to take that vote to go do it. Many, many legislators in many, many senates over the generations have talked about doing this. In fact, President Ronald Reagan talked about getting rid of federal money for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in the early 1980s. It didn't happen. But guess what? Today, we can actually go do that. We don't have to sit by anymore and send it and continue to send the hard-earned tax dollars that are sent here by the guys that swing the hammer and the gals who drive the trucks back in Missouri, who should be mortified that they're spending money for the head of NPR to call the president a bigot, a racist, to look over the vast continent of our country and where I come from, flyover country, and look down on them and actually use our money for programming to tell them that every single hour of every single day. Enough is enough. So that's the charge here today, Mr. President. Let the vote-a-rama begin.
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that there be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to each vote in relation to Calendar 114 and of H.R. 4.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that it be in order for the following senators to be recognized to offer amendments, motions, or points of order, that the amendments be reported by number with no amendments in order prior to a vote in relation to the amendments on motions. 1, Coons 2856. 2, Cortez Mastro, motion to recommit regarding CPB impacting public safety. 3, Gallego, motion to recommit re-CPB rural tribal. 4, Hirono, motion to recommit re-CPB emergency alert system. And 5, Baldwin 2855.
Without objection. Senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, I call up my amendment number 2856 and ask it be reported by number.
Clerk will report.
Senator from Delaware, Mr. Coons, proposes amendment number 2856 to amendment number 2853.
Mr. President, it was Ronald Reagan who said America is great because America is good. My amendment would restore $496 million of international disaster relief funding by removing it from this recision package. This money doesn't just save lives in countries around the world when they suffer from earthquakes and tornadoes, hurricanes, and natural disasters. It strengthens our standing, brings us closer to our allies, and helps us compete with China. 2 months ago, I visited the Philippines on a bipartisan CODEL and was struck to learn it is the most natural disaster-prone country on earth. Today, they're giving us access to 9 new military sites. They are one of our strongest treaty partners in the region. And why? When I asked their leaders, they said because America helps respond to disasters. $496 million, 0.01% of the debt Republicans have just added to our nation in the last 2 weeks. And this money is implemented by Catholic Relief Services, World Vision, the World
Senator's
Food
time has
Program.
expired.
I ask my colleagues to support it.
Senator from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in opposition to this amendment from Senator Coons that strikes the recision for international disaster assistance, IDA. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Many foreign governments and UN agencies have become reliant on U.S. emergency funding, using it to avoid investing in their own disaster preparedness. IDA is intended to aid in response to emergencies around the world, but instead, it has gone to things like $3 million for sexual reproductive health in Venezuela, $2.1 million for climate resilience in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and East Africa, and $2.4 million to make aid more considerate of sexual orientation and gender identity. IDA will still have unobligated funds, more than $6 billion, that the administration may use as they see fit. With that, Mr. President, I urge my colleagues to vote no on Amendment 2856.
Mr. President.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester,
Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lemus, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran. Mr. Marino, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Heinrich, Kane, Kelly, Lujan, Murray, Padilla, Schatz, and Slotkin. Senators voting in the negative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Budd, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Curtis, Daines, Grassley, Hoven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Kennedy, Marshall, Moody, Marino, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Cruz, no. Ms. Collins, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Mullen, no. Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Justice, no. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Kim, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye.
Recision package that would cancel billions of dollars in foreign assistance. It would make permanent the cuts that were carried out by DOGE earlier this year. That was when this administration gave Elon Musk the authority to put American foreign aid programs through the wood chipper. They justified those cuts by saying they would save money. But here we are, 6 months later. Not only have they passed a reconciliation bill that increases the national debt by more than $3 trillion, that shifts the financial burden to state and local governments. In New Hampshire, there is going to be a massive cost shift because of the passage of that bill. And for all the talk about saving money, I don't think DOGE has saved a dime. Earlier this spring, CBS News reported that the federal government has spent $200 billion more in its first 100 days this year than it did last year. And according to the Partnership for Public Service, DOGE's cuts could cost American taxpayers as much as $135 billion